No puppet this time. I'm trying to make sure you can see as much of the game as possible. I always have a challenge when I talk about games that are primarily vibes. Part of this is that I had my vibes removed as a youth. It's tragic, but it's true. If you've ever dealt with me for any length of time, you'll realize that I'm a real bad hang. Part of this is because I take the thing that most people regard as their outlet away from work and effort, and I instead made it so that I'm constantly thinking about it in terms of work. This is a thing that I understand streamers have to deal with as well, but also streamers don't have to write a PhD, which, you know, goods and bads at work there. Tanuki Sunset is a beautiful, wonderful experience of a game in which you play what I am assuming is a raccoon, but the game calls a tanuki, and I know those aren't the same things, but I don't know if the game knows those aren't the same thing. Point is, you're on a skateboard going in an infinitely long, circuitous route along some kind of highway towards the sunset, enjoying amazing retro music styled after basically what people in 2017 were imagining as the music of the 80s. And along the way, you are dealing with things on the road, things off the road, and your ability to maintain your position on that road. It is a very pure game. I, in fact, played some of this footage here while doing my teeth. One-handed play is very doable, and sure, I'm not very good at it. You can tell. But what's really remarkable is that this here is my better way of playing. When I first started playing the game, I used the controller because I'd been told, you know, video games are generally better with a controller, and I had it plugged in. So I assumed that the controller would bring with it some loose analogness to try and flow from point to point on the road, that it was going to be important how the game felt. And while playing it like this, I proceeded to never get past the first part of the first stage. And I played it extensively like this. I really put in the effort, about 2 hours of play with the controller, trying very, very hard to get what I wanted out of the game experience, since I assumed I was doing it right. I came very close to giving up on Tanuki Sunset and just putting the game away entirely, because ultimately, what was it going to do? If I couldn't get any progress in the game, what kind of thing could I say about it? Aside from the extremely comical through line that apparently I'm just terrible at games with skateboards, since I also had to bail on Magic Trick and Skatebird. Still, I came back to it and tried using the keyboard controls, and it turns out I'm really a lot better with the keyboard controls. And I don't know what's going on there. Part of me wonders if I just have a controller that's not very good. Another part of it wonders if my hands are just so practiced with keyboards that I'm just not familiar with how a controller is meant to work. But I do use a controller for other games. I use a controller for Metroidvanias. In fact, I had it plugged in explicitly because I played the demo of a very cool Metroidvania called Gestalt. So I was left thinking about this, and of course, being as I am in the space of games academia, I turned my mind to the work of Jesper Juul. Jesper Juul, if you're not familiar, is the author of the book Half Real, Real Rules in Fictional Worlds. I think Half Real is a great book. It's very important to games studies in general, and it establishes a lot of ideas that have become very important in the conversation around video games in particular when engaging with games for an academic audience. Now, one problem I have as an academic is that my field of interest, which is tabletop and board games, is that it tends to get treated more as a function of mathematics rather than a function of games as cultural elements, whereas video games get a lot of attention in that second factor. It turns out someone started a set of blog posts about the question of, are video games art? And we kind of haven't shut up about it since. In the context of Juul's work, though, what Tanuki Sunset put me in mind of is in fact actually a different book called The Art of Failure. The Art of Failure is a breezy read. It is maybe 100 pages with a very large, well-referenced catalog at the back. It is a book fundamentally about why we do things we know we aren't going to succeed at. Why is it that we pursue a type of success which has to come at the same time with failure? Why do we try things that are going to be hard, and how is it that not having the failure available makes them unsatisfying? It's a really good book, and I even use some concepts out of the book for my own work. Particularly, one idea is that he breaks down categories and types of failure in the work. What he calls the paradox of failure is about the idea of how we want to not fail. That is not to say that we want to succeed, but we want to have failure available as an option, but we still don't want to fail, which means that there is a strange way in which a game is designed to fill itself with things that you don't want it to give you. There are more bottomless pits in Mario Brothers than there are princesses in castles. Yet, for some reason, the game is seen as being mostly about the princess in the castle, and not at all about the many, many different bottomless pits. There is also the way that games are perceived on two different competing levels at once. In the context of Tanuki Sunset, there isn't a lot of story at work here. There is a deliberate unreality to everything that's happening. When I fall off the road, I'm not even falling off. That is happening on the layer of game abstraction and game rules. You can tell because the only consequence of it is I retry. The story does not say, oh, well, sorry, because you fell off the road at this point, different sort of circumstances are happening, and now the road has been replaced with a different development program. No. We switch between the perceptions of the game rule experience and the game fiction experience pretty fluidly, and that's one of those other ways in which these video games create and promote vibes. Because if this game was completely failure-free, it wouldn't be enjoyable to settle into in the same way. But at the same time, when I do fail, all that happens is I'm reset a bit of distance, and I get back to doing what I was doing. I got very frustrated in this, but not so frustrated that I ever fell out of the groove of enjoying the vibes, sliding along the road on this silly skateboard with this little Tanuki. This creates what Yule calls a paradigm between real failure, when a player invests time into playing a game and fails, and fictional failure, which is what befalls the characters in the fictional game world. I almost experienced real failure when I had my controller problem. I almost put this game away and decided to talk about Cobalt Core instead, for example. But I came back to it and I tried again, and instead of facing non-stop fictional failure, I found a way to proceed with the game. The fact that my controller might be a bit crap, or my hands might not be well suited to playing with a controller at all, is not really something Tanuki Sunset is about. This is one of the ways in which the conversation around video games in particular, and games more broadly, tends to struggle with what language it wants to adopt. There is a tendency towards considering video games in terms of how they are cinematic. The language of cinema gets used. Particularly, there are terms that we borrow from the way cinema uses them in the conversations around how movies are made and what they are for. But the thing is, movies and games are so fundamentally and wildly different that there really isn't any way to directly compare them without ignoring an awful lot about what makes video games video games. In the language of cinema, it doesn't matter if my controller is bad. It doesn't matter if my speakers are bad. It doesn't matter if my TV is bad. The actual cinema product is completely, coherently consistent from production to production. Even if I perceive it strangely, even if my experience of it is mangled in some way, that is not seen as infringing on the text. Whereas, if I struggle with a particular type of video game, if I don't like a particular type of video game, or, more interestingly, if I seek disability access to a video game, there is a perception that that somehow changes what the video game is. This is, on the one hand, very interesting, and on the other hand, sucks a lot. I have made my peace with FromSoft games. I played one I really loved called Dark Souls 2, and thereafter I felt I was just repeating the same kind of formula, and the conversations they gave me access to were with the most tiresome of sweaty nerds. But watching from afar, seeing people who wanted to play FromSoft games who were excluded from them, and the attitudes of people towards things like cheat codes and disability access and tourist modes of these games, made me consider just how awful that experience is in what it offers, because part of what that game offers is its community. Playing any given game on its own is isolated, and you can have an experience that is entirely your own. But it is in the nature of video games to include within them a common space. We talk to one another about games, we share games, we have our own experiences of games. When I talk about games in an academic context, one specific idea I try to make people understand I'm using is my opinion that play is a paratext. A paratext is a concept from Gerard Genette back in the 90s in the book Paratext: Thresholds of Interpretation. This book pretty much lays out the idea that you have the text, which is the literal narrative sequence of words in a book, as it were, and then you have the paratext, which is all the elements that allow you to engage with that. Gerard's idea was expanded on by Consalvo and Lunenfeld, which I should be able to pronounce more confidently, but I just keep on mixing up my M's and my N's. I'm really sorry. Anyway, point is that paratext originally was used to talk about and think about books, but Genette knew, on the whole, that text was already too broad a topic to confine to books. In the opening paragraphs of the book, translated roughly from French, there is the phrase, "A text, more or less, is a collection of words, more or less, that conveys a meaning, more or less." We know that there is flexibility here. When we talk about paratext in movies and videos and in music, there is often things like the elements of composition used to bring it out. Is a particular performance of a musical piece the same thing as that recording played back? Is a recording played on a particular type of headphones or a particular headset going to change the nature of the text? And the answer to that is because it's all part of a threshold, a zone. I myself like to point out the way that advertising for movies can change your perception of the movie, which in turn changes your experience of a movie. There's also the idea of the hypertext, where experiencing some text and then experiencing it again changes it because the text is itself informing on the text. This is all the fun stuff we do in the academic world. Paratext in the context of video games is a created text that is a product of experiencing a text. So if you take a game and you are to just play it, you have created a text which is your playthrough of that game, your experiencing of that game in your way. And this may be very similar to the texts of other people, but you know they can't be the same to everyone. Some people have an easier time with games, some people have a harder time with games, some people run into a wall early on, throw the controller across the room and decide they're not going to play anymore. The text of that game does not end at the point where that person has put down their controller, nor has their engagement with the game somehow been fake because they struggled. Rather, instead, the game is still there as a whole text of its own, but the playing of it is the paratext. This is important to consider because it means that games are themselves creative acts. When you play a game, you are creating something in conversation with the thing that you are playing. The game creates a boundary, a border, a canvas, and you, in your play experience, get to engage with that and make your own thing. The way I describe it is that a game is a machine that makes stories. Every time I fail as this little raccoon, the raccoon doesn't really know. There's nothing there to know. You know that my story is one where I struggle a lot, but I still get to the next city, and I still see more of the game. Everything else aside, this game is really sweet, and I enjoyed playing it a lot. You know, once I got over my bad control issues.